March 12, 1945. USS Intrepid, steaming 200 miles southeast of Kyushu. Lieutenant Commander Douglas Whitmore stood on the carrier's bridge as the morning sun burned through the last wisps of fog, revealing the vast expanse of the Pacific stretching in every direction. The air tasted of salt and diesel fuel, and somewhere far below in the ready room, his pilots were preparing for another day of combat air patrol. The radio crackled to life with a transmission that made every man on the bridge freeze. A Japanese fighter was approaching from the northeast, transmitting on an emergency frequency. The voice spoke broken English, repeating the same phrase again and again. American ship, engine failure, request permission land, request permission land. Whitmore grabbed the handset from the communications officer, his jaw tight. 26 years of naval service had taught him to expect the unexpected, but this defied every protocol, every tactical consideration. A Zero pilot asking to land on an American carrier. The audacity was staggering. The danger was obvious. Through his binoculars he could see the aircraft now. It came in low over the water, trailing a thin stream of black smoke from its engine cowling. The pilot was waggling his wings in the international signal of distress, his landing gear already extended. Whitmore calculated the angles, the distances, the risks. If this was a kamikaze ruse, if the pilot intended to crash deliberately into the deck, hundreds of men would die. But if the aircraft truly was crippled, if the pilot genuinely sought refuge rather than death, turning him away meant watching a man spiral into the ocean.
"Sir?"
The operations officer stood at his shoulder, waiting for orders. The fighter was less than 3 miles out now, descending steadily. Every second brought it closer to the point of no return. Whitmore made his decision. Clear the deck. Battle stations. All gun crews track that aircraft, but hold fire. Unless I give explicit orders. If he deviates from approach vector by even 1 degree, shoot him down. He paused, the weight of command settling over him like a physical thing. And get the crash crew ready. If he's really landing, he's going to need help the moment he touches down. The Japanese pilot had never seen anything like it. Lieutenant Kenji Ishida, 23 years old, son of a Osaka fisherman, graduate of the Naval Air Training Center at Tsuchiura, felt his engine seizing as the American carrier grew larger in his windscreen. The connecting rod had failed 20 minutes ago, and now the entire power plant was coming apart. Metal ground against metal with a sound like screaming. Oil streaked across his canopy, black and thick. He had perhaps 3 minutes of power remaining, perhaps less. Below him, the American ship was enormous. He had attacked carriers before, had watched them from altitude as they maneuvered to avoid his squadron's bombs, but he had never truly comprehended their scale. The flight deck stretched nearly 300 meters from bow to stern, wider than any street in Tokyo. Men swarmed across its surface like ants, clearing aircraft, rigging barriers, preparing for his arrival. Gun barrels tracked his approach, dozens of them, all trained on his fragile aircraft. He thought of his father, mending nets in the morning darkness. He thought of his mother's letters, which had stopped coming 6 months ago when the American submarines cut the supply lines to the home islands. He thought of the last briefing his commander had given, 3 days before, when the old man had spoken of honor and sacrifice, and the divine wind that would drive the Americans from Japanese waters. But Ishida had seen the divine wind. He had watched it carry his friends into the sides of American ships, watched them vanish in flowers of flame that accomplished nothing, changed nothing, saved nothing. His engine coughed. The propeller windmilled uselessly. The carrier's deck filled his vision now, and he could see individual faces staring up at him. American faces. Enemy faces. He cut his speed, felt the Zero shudder and yaw, corrected with rudder pressure that sent pain shooting through his wounded leg. The injury had come from a Hellcat's .50 caliber burst 4 hours ago, and blood had soaked through his flight suit, sticky and warm. He was lightheaded, possibly dying, certainly at the end of his strength. The deck rushed up to meet him. He flared at the last moment, felt the wheels touch, felt the tail hook catch the arresting cable with a jolt that snapped his head forward. The Zero stopped in less than 30 meters. Silence descended, broken only by the tick of cooling metal and the sound of his own ragged breathing. American sailors surrounded the aircraft within seconds. Ishida sat in his cockpit, hands raised, waiting for bullets or bayonets or whatever death awaited him. Instead, a young sailor with red hair and freckles climbed onto the wing, pulled open the canopy and extended his hand. The sailor's name tag read, Morrison. His eyes were wide with something that might have been fear or might have been wonder. "Come on, buddy," Morrison said. "Let's get you out of there. They carried him to the sick bay, where a ship's doctor named Paul Simmons examined the leg wound with practiced efficiency. The bullet had passed through the muscle without hitting bone or artery. Simmons cleaned it, sutured it, wrapped it in clean white bandages that smelled of antiseptic. Through the porthole, Ishida could see other aircraft launching and landing, the endless cycle of carrier operations continuing as if nothing unusual had occurred. "You're lucky," Simmons said, speaking slowly, unsure how much English his patient understood. "Another inch to the left, and you'd have bled out before you reached us." Ishida nodded. Lucky. The word tasted strange. He had been taught that luck was for the weak, that a true warrior made his own fate through courage and dedication. But sitting in this clean, well-lit medical bay, being treated by an enemy doctor with hands as gentle as his own mother's, Ishida wondered what words like warrior and enemy truly meant. The interrogation began that afternoon. An intelligence officer named Reynolds conducted it, assisted by a translator who had learned Japanese at the University of California. They asked about his unit, his base, his recent missions. Ishida answered some questions, refused others, and gradually came to understand that they were not particularly interested in extracting secrets through torture or intimidation. They asked. He answered or did not. They wrote things down. The process felt almost mundane. What struck him most profoundly was not the questioning but the environment. Between sessions he was held in a small compartment that had been converted into a makeshift cell. A Marine guard stood outside, but the door was not locked. They brought him meals 3 times a day, hot food in quantities he had not seen since before the war. Roasted chicken, fresh bread, vegetables that still had color and texture, coffee with real sugar. The first night he ate everything, then felt ashamed of his hunger, ashamed that American abundance could make him forget his principles so quickly. On the 3rd day, Reynolds took him on a tour. The intelligence officer had decided, for reasons Ishida did not fully understand, that the Japanese pilot should see the ship. They walked through passageways lined with pipes and cables, through compartments where men slept in tiered bunks or played cards or wrote letters home. They descended into the engineering spaces, where massive turbines spun with a sound like controlled thunder, generating power enough to drive the enormous vessel at speeds Ishida would not have believed possible. 40,000 horsepower, Reynolds said, shouting over the machinery noise. "We have machine shops that can fabricate replacement parts for almost anything on board. We have a dentist, a barber, even a small library. 2,700 men live and work on this ship, Lieutenant. It's a floating city." They climbed back to the hangar deck, where dozens of aircraft sat in careful rows. Hellcats and Avengers, their blue-gray paint gleaming under artificial lights. Mechanics swarmed over the planes, replacing engines, repairing battle damage, conducting routine maintenance. What amazed Ishida was not the number of aircraft, but the attitude of the men working on them. They were not frantic or desperate. They moved with the calm efficiency of factory workers, as if building instruments of war was no different than building automobiles or refrigerators. A young mechanic noticed Ishida watching and walked over. His name tag read, Chen. He looked barely old enough to shave, but his hands were stained with grease and his eyes held the confidence of expertise. "You fly the Zero, right?" Chen asked. "I've always wanted to see one up close. Mind if I ask you some questions about the engine design?" Ishida stared at him. This American boy wanted to discuss engineering. Not tactics or strategy or the righteousness of his cause, but the technical specifications of the Nakajima Saki radial engine. For 20 minutes, they talked through the translator about compression ratios and cooling systems and the persistent problem of oil consumption at high altitude. Chen listened with genuine interest, occasionally offering observations about how American engines solved similar problems differently. That evening, Whitmore invited Ishida to dine in the officers' mess. The invitation was not a request. 2 Marines escorted the Japanese pilot to a compartment where a dozen American officers sat around a long table. Ishida expected hostility, perhaps confrontation, but instead found himself seated between a fighter pilot named Sullivan and a navigator named Thompson. They ate roasted beef and potatoes while discussing the relative merits of various aircraft designs. "Your Zero is faster and more maneuverable than our Hellcats," Sullivan admitted. "But you trade armor and firepower for that performance. We can absorb more damage, deliver heavier strikes. Different philosophies, different priorities." Thompson nodded. "I flew patrol over Guadalcanal in 42. Lost count of how many Zeros I saw. Incredible planes in the right hands. But now?" He gestured around the room. "We're building carriers faster than you can sink them. Building planes faster than you can shoot them down. Building everything faster than you can destroy it." The words were not boastful. They were simply factual, and that made them more devastating than any insult. Ishida thought of the mechanics he had watched that afternoon, replacing an engine in less than 2 hours. He thought of the meal he had just eaten, richer than anything available in Japan even before the war. He thought of the casual confidence with which these American officers discussed their industrial capacity, as if unlimited resources were simply the natural order of things. Whitmore leaned forward, his weathered face serious. "Lieutenant Ishida, I want to show you something tomorrow, with your permission." Permission, another strange word in this strange place. Ishida was a prisoner, a captured enemy combatant with no rights and no power. Yet they asked permission. He nodded slowly. The next morning, they took him to the bridge. From this elevated position, he could see the entire task force spread across the ocean. Carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, supply vessels, all moving in precise formation. Reynolds handed him binoculars and pointed toward the horizon. "Count them, Lieutenant. I'll wait." Ishida counted. 17 major warships, dozens of support vessels, hundreds of aircraft visible on the carrier decks. This was just one task force among many. He had heard the reports, had listened to commanders insist that American losses were unsustainable, that one more great victory would force the enemy to negotiate. But looking at this armada, understanding that it represented only a fraction of American naval power, Ishida felt something inside him crack and crumble. "We have 11 fleet carriers in the Pacific right now," Reynolds said quietly. 5 more are completing their shakedown cruises on the East Coast. We're commissioning a new Essex-class carrier every 8 weeks. How many carriers does Japan have left, Lieutenant? Ishida did not answer. He did not need to. They both knew the truth. The Shokaku was gone. The Zuikaku was gone. The great ships that had struck Pearl Harbor were resting on the ocean floor, and Japan no longer possessed the resources to replace them. The war that his commanders insisted could still be won was already over. It had been over for years, perhaps. They simply lacked the honesty to admit defeat, or the courage to stop. That night, alone in his compartment, Ishida wrote a letter he knew would never be sent. He wrote to his father about abundance he had witnessed, the casual plenty that Americans accepted as normal. He wrote about mechanics who discussed engineering with enemy pilots, about doctors who treated wounds without asking which side a man fought for, about a captain who offered dinner to his prisoner not as humiliation, but as simple human courtesy. He wrote about the moment when belief transforms into understanding, when propaganda dissolves in the face of undeniable reality. He had been taught that Americans were soft, decadent, incapable of sustaining sacrifice. Instead, he had found men who worked 18-hour shifts maintaining aircraft, who ate their meals and wrote their letters, and then went back to war with the mechanical efficiency of people who had never doubted victory. They were not superior warriors. They were not divinely favored. They simply possessed resources so vast that individual courage and dedication could not overcome the mathematical certainty of their triumph. The war ended 5 months later. Ishida remained aboard the Intrepid throughout that time, helping with translation work, answering questions about Japanese tactics and capabilities, slowly coming to terms with the magnitude of his nation's defeat. On August 15th, when the Emperor's radio broadcast announced the surrender, Ishida stood on the flight deck with hundreds of American sailors and watched them cheer. He did not cheer, but neither did he feel anger or shame. He felt only a profound exhaustion, the bone-deep weariness of a man who had carried an impossible burden and finally been permitted to set it down. Years later, after repatriation, after rebuilding, after Japan transformed from enemy to ally, Ishida would remember his time aboard the Intrepid with strange clarity. He would remember Morrison's hand extended in greeting, Simmons's gentle treatment of his wound, Chen's enthusiastic questions about engine design, Whitmore's quiet dignity as he showed a captured enemy the full scope of American power. He would remember understanding, in those March days of 1945, that the war had been lost not through any failure of Japanese courage but through the simple reality of facing an opponent who could build faster than destruction could occur. The lessons stayed with him. The abundance he witnessed, the casual plenty that seemed almost obscene to a man raised in scarcity, represented something more profound than mere material advantage. It represented a different way of thinking about war and peace, about competition and cooperation, about the purposes for which nations mobilized their strength. The Americans had not sought to destroy for the sake of destruction. They had sought to win, certainly, but also to preserve, to rebuild, to transform enemies into partners. He never flew combat again. He became an engineer instead, helping to design commercial aircraft for the new Japan that rose from the ashes of the old. And sometimes, in the quiet hours of the morning, he would think of that day when his engine failed and necessity forced him to land on the deck of an enemy ship, where where he discovered that enemies could become something else entirely, given time and understanding, and the courage to see beyond the boundaries of propaganda and hate. If you have enjoyed the story, tell YouTube to send you more stories like this by subscribing to this channel, liking the video, and leaving a comment.